The specter of terrorism hits Moscow. Recrimination and speculation fly to find the parties responsible. Russia experienced a deadly terrorist attack in 2 decades when 4 gunmen entered the Crocus City Hall, located 12 miles from the Kremlin, on Friday, March 22, 2024. Before a rock concert was to start, the gunmen opened fire around 8 p.m. local time on the crowd, and in 20 minutes, at least 134 people were killed and over 150 people were wounded, and the venue was on fire. The Russian police and FSB, the Russian replacement for the Soviet-era KGB, reported arresting all 4 gunmen directly involved and 7 others that were suspected of providing support for the attack. After the attack, the narrative of who is responsible for the attack in Moscow has started, and as expected, the identity and motive for the attack is clouded by the fog of the Ukraine-Russia war, as accusations and counter-accusations are battling for world opinion. Hours after the attack, the Islamic State, IS, who took credit for the attack on Moscow. The U.S. later clarified that it was ISIS-K, which has been given an allegiance to the Islamic State and predominantly operates out of Afghanistan. IS or ISIS-K are both sworn enemies of Russia, and Russian mercenaries sided with the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad and are credited with saving the Syrian leader and playing a significant role in degrading the Islamic groups fighting in the civil war against al-Assad. Russia has also fostered closer relations with the Taliban in Afghanistan, which are fighting for control of the country against ISIS-K and other groups. The U.S. did state to the press that they did warn Russia of a potential terrorist attack from ISIS-K against Russia. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow did warn U.S. citizens to avoid concert halls and other gathering places in early March, and stated that they did pass on this information to the Russian government. The Russians, including Putin, dismissed the warnings from the U.S. as provocative and an attempt to sow discord in the Russian society. After the attack, the Russian government stated that the U.S. warnings lacked specificity to be acted upon. So critics of the U.S. and its warnings are being scrutinized to what the U.S. State Department provided to the Russian government. This ignoring of the U.S. warnings by Russia is a result of mistrust between the two countries and is another cost of the Ukraine-Russian war. The U.S. and parts of Europe's policy in supporting the war in Ukraine is to create so many casualties on the battlefield and economic pain on the Russian oligarchs and the general population that popular society or politically connected in Russia would overthrow President Vladimir Putin. It is easy to see how the Russian president, after his recent re-election, would view any message from the West about the terrorist attack in Russia as anything but a continuation of the campaign to destabilize Russia, the Russian society, due to the war. Russia being at war with the Ukraine has naturally led to the Russian public and government to immediately suspect Ukraine. The idea is at least plausible, as some Ukrainian leaders have called on carrying out attacks deeper into Russia to make the Russian population experience the war. The other disbelief is ISIS-K or IS carrying out the attack is that the group simply taking credit for the attack is not proof. The Islamist groups have a motivation to take credit for attacks they did not commit. They can use the headlines and publicity of the attack to take credit, so to provide a morale boost to its supporters that they could still carry attacks to the enemy, and this could be a catalyst to gain volunteers in their continuing fights throughout the Middle East and Western Asia. The Russians claim that they made arrests of the terrorists as they were heading toward the Ukrainian border. This would make sense for any terrorist group to attempt to flee Russia. If the terrorists crossed in Ukraine, the Russian authorities could not pursue or operate in Ukraine, and it is doubtful that the Ukraine would turn the terrorists over to Russia if the Ukrainians did capture them. So trying to flee the Ukraine does not imply Ukraine involvement. During the Russian presidential election, March 15th through the 17th of 2024, groups of anti-Putin Russian militant groups, supported by the Ukraine, have stepped up cross-border attacks from northern Ukraine into Russia. The attacks made headlines and led to temporary seizures of some Russian towns, but were quickly repulsed by the Russian military. These groups operate with the full support of the Ukrainian government to carry out the war in Russia. Ukraine has also conducted minor drone strikes in Russia, or in Moscow particularly, in the past, so has also attacked Moscow as well in the past. So the Russians would naturally look at the Ukrainians as they are at war with them. The deadliest terrorist attack prior to last week's Moscow attack was conducted by Chechen rebels who were in their own battle for independence from Russia. That 2004 attack killed over 300, predominantly children, including casualties caused by the Russian attempt to use armed force to end the standoff. So there's more parallels that the Russian populace can connect. The reason why the Chechens, who still want their independence from Russia, are not suspected in this attack is that they have sided with Russia in the war with Ukraine to provide fighters to Russia. The Chechens hope that supporting Moscow will help with their independence bid. One factor that plays into backing the Ukraine denials is that terrorist attacks of these sorts would hurt the Ukrainian cause. Ukraine is almost fully dependent on Western aid to resist the Russian invasion and to keep the economy and society afloat. The West, having been targets of terrorist attacks themselves, are not likely to support any such attack on Russian citizens, even when the most of the public supports Ukraine in its war. Public support in the West is soft support, as the cost of the war after 2 full years is showing signs of wear. A Ukraine government-supported terrorist attack would certainly turn large parts of the West's citizens against Ukraine and would make it impossible for the West to continue to support the Ukraine war at anywhere close to the levels of today, or they would demand that Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky and his government step down. That would be a win for one of Russia's original war aims. Ukraine involvement would also put the civilian population of Kyiv in greater danger from a vengeful Russian military, which would also destabilize the Ukraine government's hold on power. France has been calling for European NATO countries to consider sending ground troops and more direct intervention in Ukraine to counter Russia. This French proposal is a red line for most NATO countries, but is starting to get some support within Europe. This would be a monumental boost to the Ukraine cause if it comes to fruition, but a Ukrainian terrorist attack on Moscow would end all traction to the French effort as well. Other minor but emotionally charged theories in both the West and Russia is the idea that the CIA conducted the operation to erode Russian support for the war, but this would also be counterproductive to Western government support for the war. This theory is easy to take hold after the Nord Stream 2 explosion mystery, but it is more Russian public consumption to help continue the war against Ukraine. The other theory is that this was Russia conducting a false flag operation and executed a terrorist attack on its own soil and citizens to blame Ukraine and redouble the effort in Ukraine and its calls for ever greater sacrifice. Though in the wartime environment in Europe, this can be plausible, but would Russia really need to have such a significant attack to get the same results to blame Ukraine? The leading plausible theory is that ISIS-K or IS conducted the attack on Moscow, not because any group would not have a reason to attack Moscow in a time of war, but because of the lack of incentive for Ukraine to carry out the attack. Ukraine does have a desire for revenge, but this desire is largely outweighed by the high likelihood of losing Western support altogether if they did conduct the attack. Losing Western support to Ukraine means an outright defeat of Ukraine to the Russians. There will certainly be other details to emerge from the attack and the potential response that could provide a clearer picture in the coming days and weeks as details that are not available today start to come forward.